Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. I want to tell you about some friends and a program that is very dear to my heart, Online Great Books. If you've been listening to the Catholic Culture Podcast for a while, you may remember my interview with Online Great Books founder Scott Hambrick back in episode 27. I always had an interest in reading through the great books of the Western world list, but I always felt that I wouldn't get as much out of them reading through on my own. I wanted to find a group of people to do it with me, but that's kind of hard to do. It's hard to get a group of people to commit to reading through even one book, let alone a list as long as that. Online Great Books solved this problem for me. It is a monthly seminar program, essentially, online seminars, putting you together with a group of people and a trained seminar leader to take you through pretty much the entire Great Books list composed by Mortimer Adler. The simplest way to explain the program is basically they send you the book that you'll be reading each month, and you get on there and attend the seminar on Zoom. One of the great things about this program is that it's really designed for people with a life, people with jobs, people with families. It's a very approachable pace, about 300 pages of reading a month, just one seminar per month, although if you're like me, you'll probably wish there were more seminars, because that was one of the things I looked forward to most every month, honestly. Really, the greatest value of this program is the people it puts you together with. It's just invaluable to have a group of people from all different backgrounds, intellectually, culturally, to discuss the books with. I mean, there's people who did great in school, there's people who did terrible in school and want to take a second shot at it in adulthood. The cool thing is that I've found that no matter what education level or even level of intelligence someone might have, anyone who's really invested and sincere in participating in this adds something of value to the discussion. Just to give you an example of the variety of people you'll be interacting with and gaining insight in discussions with, in my seminar when I was participating in the program, there were two TV writers living in LA, there was a farmer in Southern Virginia, there was an Episcopalian priest. Some of them were conservative, some of them were liberal, some of them were religious, and some not. But you gain from discussing these books with people who do share a worldview closer to your own and those who don't. Also, just the different cultural backgrounds can be valuable. For example, when you're reading Homer's Odyssey, the second book in the program, and Homer talks about, the character of the swineherd and the character of the goatherd, having a farmer in your group is actually kind of useful because he is intimately familiar with the character of these different animals and what the kind of archetype or stereotype of a goat herd might be. There's also a great roster of seminar leaders. I mean, one of the memorable characters would be Malachi. Malachi was in advertising for decades. He's in his 80s. And back in the day, he was part of the team that worked on Tony the Tiger. He was part of the team that worked on The Few, The Proud, The Brave, The Marines. And Malachi is fascinated with the art of rhetoric and has a lot of insight on that. There's John. He's a Catholic and a philosophy professor. He knows a lot about Aristotle. There's Emmett, and Emmett's a communist, but he will help you get through Euclid. And it's amazing. These are people you're going to want to hang out with in real life. I've gotten together in real life with people who weren't even part of my seminar, but were part of the wider online Great Books community, people I met in the Slack channel, for instance. An Orthodox Christian dude I went out for lunch with in Manhattan. And when I was in Chicago last year for the Catholic Imagination Conference, I met up with Carl, who's a Byzantine Catholic and a strength trainer, and Marcia, who's a classical educator. It's just a great community, and I really found that, especially with works of fiction, I could get a lot more out of discussing these things with other people than I would reading them on my own. I guess I'm more geared towards philosophy. I can kind of create the dialectic in my own head to some extent if I'm reading a work of philosophy, but works of literature, definitely a lot of thoughts come out that I wouldn't have been able to generate just sitting by myself reading the book. Also, I got to say, the seminars are so much fun that it kind of solves another problem of going through the great books, which is motivating yourself to keep going. I was really motivated to do my reading every month. and go above and beyond because I was looking forward to that seminar and I wanted to be ready. If you want to learn more about the program, I recommend going back again to episode 27, listening to my interview with the founder, Scott. For now, let me just tell you, Online Great Books has an enrollment period opening on October 13th, and I would recommend, if you're interested, getting on the waiting list now. And as soon as you sign up there, they'll go ahead and start sending you some materials even before the enrollment period has started. So if you'd like to sign up, what I'd ask you to do is to go to the show notes page for this episode and use the special referral link that Online Great Books has given us. That way, you will get 25% off your first 3 months of your subscription, and you'll help us out as well. If you do sign up, I think you'll really enjoy finding a great group of people to accompany you on your journey from Homer to Aristotle to Augustine and Aquinas and beyond. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. You may have noticed that through all these months, I basically haven't mentioned the coronavirus at all on this show. And that's because my way of operating here is usually to not talk about what everybody else is already talking about. And also, it's kind of an arts and culture show, generally speaking. So when I do venture into other areas, it is usually because I feel like something is being underaddressed. So that said, I recently came across a couple of essays that I thought were so good on the topic that I wanted to have both of the authors on here together to discuss both those essays and more broadly, the prospects for civil disobedience of coronavirus-related lockdowns. One was in Catholic World Report titled The Health-First Heresy. In The American Mind, which I read from time to time, was an article titled The Limits of Expertise. The Health-First Heresy deals more with the church's response and the response of religious people generally, but particularly of the Catholic Church to government lockdowns of religious services. And the limits of expertise is, as the title indicates, a critique of the whole just follow the experts, just listen to the science approach, which is very simplistic and kind of deceptive in a number of ways. So I have with me today the author of The Health-First Heresy, Douglas Farrow, professor of theology and Christian thought at McGill University in Canada, and the author of The Limits of Expertise, Andrew Busch. He is Crown Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. Douglas and Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Also, Andrew, I believe you have the distinction of being my first Protestant guest who was not here to talk about Tolkien. So the basic structure of this discussion will be, first we're going to talk about the religious side of things, then we'll proceed to the government policy side and the kind of acquiescing approach that we've taken towards a selected cadre of public health officials, and then we'll proceed on to kind of whatever may be actionable in all this. So Douglas, you wrote this essay called The Health-First Heresy. A lot of people I know found it really valuable in kind of articulating just what's wrong with a certain position taken in this internal debate among Catholics on what our attitude is to be towards the various government mandates and the advice of public health professionals, where a lot of people, I mean, the line is basically you're loving and serving your neighbor by, insert any number of things. Of course, this takes on a particular troubling aspect when some Catholics and other religious people are so quick to kind of acquiesce to a certain logic imposed by people who don't really understand the internal logic of religion and its importance. I mean, people who basically consider it to be non-essential as compared with any number of things. So I'm glad that we have a Catholic and a Lutheran here, because I think that resisting these things can and should be, and already has been, in fact, as I think we'll come to see, an ecumenical effort. Douglas, could you explain what do you mean when you say the Health-First Heresy?
It's quite simple, really. It refers to the notion that the care of the body is somehow more important than the care of the soul, or that the body can be properly cared for without attention to its relation to the soul.
A lot of people would say, though, that you are in caring for the body first under certain extreme circumstances, you actually are serving some kind of spiritual purpose insofar as either you're loving your neighbor and trying to protect them, or I suppose even they might say that you're being responsible in taking care of your own health. But particularly what's emphasized is not putting your neighbor at risk. The reason I wanted to put this segment first is that it focuses on something more fundamental. If we started with whether the public health dictates in fact do make sense from a medical standpoint, then I think that we would be missing a chance to emphasize the principle that what comes first is the worship of God, and that in fact not everything is dependent on the contingent medical situation and one's agreement or disagreement with the details of that. There are actually principles that come first, irrespective of what your view is on the severity of the virus. I mean, even if it were a much worse virus, I think the idea in your article is that these principles that you lay out would stand. We know that a bishop can legitimately suspend services temporarily in a case of persecution. For example, if there's a bomb threat, they can say, we're not going to have mass at the cathedral today because there's a bomb threat. They can alter the circumstances. They can limit the number of people who can attend. They can have it outside. There's all sorts of things that bishops can do and have done at many times in the past to change the circumstances of worship, or to temporarily keep things low key, or to do them in hiding, or whatever, throughout history. But what's the difference between those measures, which say may have been taken during the Spanish flu, and what's been happening now?
Well, we've never seen as a widespread blanket, indefinite ban on corporate acts of worship. Certainly, you're quite right. There have been many occasions in history where temporary ad hoc changes have been made, and these liturgies have been canceled or postponed. And certainly, it would be very foolish to say that the priority of the soul over the body means that the body's needs do not need to be attended to, and that the church should be untouched by prudential concerns for the care of the body, or untouched by state regulation in these matters. I am not saying anything of that sort. What I am saying is that decisions about the practice of the Christian religion, the proclamation of the Word of God, the celebration of the sacraments, the corporate life of the church, bears witness to an understanding of the relation between God and the soul and the body that works in a definite order of priority. The body is a good thing. It is made good by a good God, and the human being is both body and soul, not just a soul temporarily manipulating a body. Both body and soul are subject to God, but God rules the soul rules the body, and the concerns of the soul are to see that the whole human being responds properly to God. Now, responding properly to God is first and foremost an act of thanksgiving, of Eucharistia. That's at the heart of the right relationship between the human being and God. Of course, that then goes to acts of faithfulness and obedience, and the development of the virtues, and both for the life of the individual as such, and for the social life. Because the human life is, when good, a social life. So it reaches out to all of these other, and has implications to all of these other areas. But you have to keep the basic priorities straight. Now, we can't expect the state, or even society at large, to keep those priorities straight in a context where we're dealing with states that are unwilling even to say whether humans have souls. So we can't leave it to the state to make the prudential judgments here as to the right ordering of human life within or outside of the context of special stresses such as exist in a pandemic. Now, what kind of pandemic we're in at present and how serious it is or isn't, that's an important discussion, and I have engaged in it, but it's not the central point here. The central point here is that the church cannot cede indefinitely to the state the power to make decisions that bear on the proper ordering of the lives of human beings, and particularly of the church in its mission to proclaim the word and celebrate the sacraments. It must have the liberty to make its own decisions, working at being cooperative with the state, working at being careful of the impact of its actions on the rest of society, being careful indeed about the impact of its actions on the members of its own communities. But nevertheless, making those decisions in the light of knowledge of God, which the church claims to have, and a command of God, which belongs uniquely to the church. So the idea of an indefinite suspension of the proclamation of the word and the celebration of the sacraments for fear that a resumption of these might produce problems for the human body and therefore also for human beings and even the potential termination of their lives is to my way of thinking, to work the wrong way around. To make a prudential judgment about whether we should have Mass in this place or that place, whether we should worship at this hour or that hour, on this day or that day, this week or next week, that's not much of a problem. But the idea of an indefinite suspension of the public ministry of the church while there is a threat to bodily health, that's a problem.
You said communion can be brought to the sick rather than the sick to communion, yes, but the corporate act of communion cannot, as a matter of course, be denied to the healthy or confined to the clergy, whether in camera or on camera, without upending the Christian view of man and the world. So that's a striking point, that it's being denied to the healthy, to people who are not even particularly at risk.
Yes, I think that's important, but I don't think it's the main point because, of course, those are prudential judgments, and they are often judgments made on the basis of a certain amount of guesswork as to consequences of particular actions, including meeting with so many people in such and such a space during this or some other kind of threat, the pandemic, that is. The main point is that it belongs to the church to make its own judgments about these things within certain limits that derive from its cooperation with the state and its respect for the state's own proper authority. So if the church decides that in this case it will conduct Mass with social distancing and it will only have so many people in its buildings, there it may be in agreement with the state and making a good prudential judgment. But if the church decides, well, the state has asked us just not to hold the Holy Eucharist, not to gather, not to proclaim, not to celebrate the sacraments, and not to do so until further notice when we're quite certain that any threat to the body is past. At that point, if the church concedes, it is conceding to the state a kind of authority the state does not properly have, even if it imagines itself to have that. That would be my understanding of the matter, at least, and we'll hear from Andrew on that, I'm sure. But what I'm saying is, I think that whether it's Archbishop Cordileone in San Francisco or John MacArthur in LA, these Christian leaders are doing the right thing in saying to the state, thus far and no further. We have our own judgments to make, and we need to fulfill our mandate to make them in our own way.
Right. And you also made the point that completely ceasing the corporate worship of God is for the purposes of avoiding a disease, is no different than doing so for the purpose of avoiding persecution, which is simply an approach that the church hasn't historically taken to in times of persecution.
Yes, you alluded to this earlier. Of course, pastors, bishops have made prudential judgments about where and when and how to meet. The pastors and leaders of Christian communities have always had to make those kinds of judgment. If they could have taken the community and hidden in the forest and celebrated the Eucharist there or celebrated it later, that would have been fine. That would have been good. But we don't have that opportunity in that context. If the government is going to say to us, this pandemic could last for a couple of years. I'm sorry, you just can't proclaim the word of God or celebrate the sacraments meanwhile, because there's a risk that you'll contribute to a spike of coronavirus cases. If the state is going to say that to us, and if the courts are going to uphold that, then I guess it does become a matter of celebrating in defiance of the law and in secret. But it can't be a matter of simply not proclaiming and not celebrating. That's not a viable option in the indefinite sense. That is, without a clear postponement to X for reason Y.
Well, Andrew, I guess I'll ask you to chime in here first with two questions, really. First, does that all resonate with your sense of the discussion among people of your own denomination? I'm sure there's some kind of internal debate there. And secondly, what Douglas has said, does that resonate with the position that you take on the importance of worship in regards to state dictates and public health and things like that?
Yeah, I very much enjoyed his article, and I think there's great value in it. I think, in conversations that I've had just among members of my own church, there's a great deal of frustration. There's a sense that the state has overstepped its bounds. There are some who have said, we ought to just meet anyway. And we opened, in California, the rules have been quite stringent. We were allowed to open for a while, I think 5 weeks in the early summer. And there were great precautions taken, social distancing, masks, and all of that. There was a revision to the way that we did communion, or the timing, to kind of reduce the possibility of contagion, I guess you could say. But and we were being very, very careful. But it didn't matter to the state of California. After 5 weeks, they said, "Well, you're closed again." And we are now opening this Sunday for outdoor worship, because outdoor worship is not on the list of prohibited things. So we are doing it. But I think there certainly has been a sentiment among many with whom I've spoken that, early on, for a short time, perhaps it was understandable, but it has gone beyond that point.
I remember when this all began and this suspension of worship was first announced, I really wasn't sure whether it was warranted by the seriousness of the virus or anything like that. And I was open to debate, but I did remember, I did say at the time, there's no way that the powers that be aren't at least taking note of the fact that it was so easy to stop the mass across huge parts of the world, essentially. And we can return to kind of the precedent this sets in terms of state power, of course, and we'll return to that, not just with regard to religion, but with everything else. I don't want to tar anybody unfairly, but I have noticed, well, it's interesting because even though this is such a politicized issue, even among, say, conservatives, I've noticed a lot of different perspectives on the virus, on wearing masks and things like that. But in my experience, when I see someone who is just saying, churches, let's say a Catholic who's saying churches still shouldn't be open. What are they doing? We have to protect people, and kind of like lecturing and blaming other Catholics who are questioning the narrative. It's very common that, when you look at the other things that person is saying, there's somebody who is in many other regards capitulating to the world in all sorts of other matters. So I do see a pattern there, not in, somebody who thinks we should wear masks versus not, but in somebody who is almost so, despite calling themselves a Catholic or a Christian, almost seemingly very enthusiastic about keeping worship shut down. And it's a strange thing, which I don't entirely understand, but I guess it leads me to another point that you made, Douglas. I mean, we have to get smart at a certain point and realize the degree to which the world is run by our enemies, people who do want to stop what we're doing, people who do think what we're doing is as worshiping God is at best worthless and possibly harmful, possibly subversive in various ways. This is nothing new. And you made a point that, there's something about also the, not just in terms of the worship rendered to God, but the witness that this offers to the rest of the world, and that our cooperation with just canceling the mass, as well as our own charitable activities and things like that, does a lot to legitimize, to put it in a word, secularism. And it doesn't do anything to challenge our society's skewed values. I have a friend who, said to me, with regard to debates over healthcare and things like that, if somebody doesn't support the right to life, then how much can you really trust their sincerity in caring about lesser matters of quality of life issues and healthcare and things like that? So when we just sort of take them at their word and don't challenge, the fact that abortion clinics are still open and essential services, or the way that the elderly have been treated in certain places. I live in New York City, so I'm somewhat aware of all that. We're kind of just going with the flow without realizing kind of what the big picture upshot of all this is in regard to how we treat all these different issues. It's like we're trying to say that, yeah, of course, we're loving our neighbor by doing this. We're being responsible citizens, but we're not looking at the big picture, in which so often to be a responsible citizen on the standards of the state is to basically undermine our own faith.
Yes, I think one of the revealing things about this current situation is that it's telling us quite a lot about what secular authorities think of Christianity and Christian churches, and how little they think about whether a human being is something more than an economic unit with particular health needs. It's also telling us a lot about who we are and where our faith does and doesn't inform our actions, and whether I think it's telling us even to look at the question of whether we are serious in saying that God governs the soul and the soul governs the body, or whether we're prepared to stand that hierarchy on its head. Even when it comes to love of the neighbor, how many people amongst our leaders, how many of our laity have asked hard questions about what the lockdown is doing to neighbors? Now, where it has to do with people trapped in so-called care homes, where it has to do with the very lonely neighbor next door, yes, perhaps. But if we think about the parable of the Good Samaritan and ask the question, who is our neighbor? What about those people who live in economies that can't stand lockdowns? I think it also asks us to consider what we mean when we talk about love of the neighbor. These people who live in economies that basically work on a daily basis and on a hand-to-mouth basis, they can't afford lockdowns the way we can. Are we answering the neighbor question in terms of only people like us who have economies that we hope can recover from this? We also, I think, are being shown something about our attitude to life. Take that phrase you used, the right to life. I've always been a little uncomfortable with that phrase. Life is a gift. God has the right to give life and to recall it. Our responsibility is to receive it gratefully and respect it. Now, when we talk about the right to life, we are usually talking about a very fundamental dimension of our respect for the gift of life. But that language can creep around and back behind us to bite us, whereby we have the right to life. And yes, this virus is a threat to my life. Therefore, I must stop everything else, even the worship of God.
I have the right to not die, and I have the right to stop my neighbors from basically carrying on a normal life for that purpose, even if it's going to be a few months difference in how long I live.
Yeah. So we need to be careful about all of that. We need to think harder about who the neighbor is, and we also need to think harder about what it means to live well and to respect the gift of life by respecting the Creator. These are not things the state is going to do for us. These are not things that society at large is going to do for us. They're things that we as Christians must do. And at the same time, as I said earlier, the church needs to maintain the kind of dialogue with the state that doesn't leave it pleading for the state to get its knee off its neck, as Cardinal Lacroix did in Quebec City, but rather tells the state, we are an ambassadorial mission of Jesus Christ, and we do have certain rights, and if you don't respect those rights, you may persecute us, but we are not going to accept that we have no rights to run our own affairs and make our own prudential judgments.
What about areas where obviously divine worship is an area over which the state has actually no authority? But what about areas where church and state authority overlap? Matters of care for the sick, for example.
The realm of the spiritual is not an atemporal realm, and it is not an immaterial realm. It's both biblically and theologically. It has, again, to do with that proper ordering of human life. The life that is lived in the Spirit of God, that is the life of the church and of the member of the body of Christ, is a life lived in the flesh. It's not immaterial. It's not fleshly in the biological sense. It's not fleshly in the sense that it is not ruled by the passions. It's not ruled by the interests only of the body, or indeed by the lusts of body or soul. It's ruled rather by the right ordering that the Spirit makes possible. And so the goal of Christian life, both in community and as in families and as particular persons, is always the right ordering of life, with the recognition that God makes us and God is good and what He has made is good. So when we talk to people in our society, or we talk to the people who have authority over society, when we talk to the state, we should not be thinking in terms of, well, we deal with the spiritual, that is the eternal, the invisible, the not bodily. You deal with the bodily. That's not Christianity. That's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And it's quite clear that the state has full authority over the things of the body, on his view, and even the conscience has no authority over the body insofar as the body is a public body. That is, it is the way we relate to one another in the public sphere. So all of that falls to the state, which is one reason, of course, why Rousseau didn't like any kind of robust Christianity, and particularly sacramental Christianity, and particularly Catholicism, because it refused that dichotomy. That healthcare, education, everything that concerns both body and soul raises issues where the church and the state are going to be approaching common concerns, common matters, but from very different perspectives. And that's why in this present situation, the whole question of religious liberty does become, in fact, quite important. But I said I was going to be brief and that I wanted to hear Andrew, so I better stop.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess my view is that there are, and I, I'm not, I want to make clear, I have no pretensions to being a trained theologian. I actually think that the Lutheran doctrinal position on that over time has probably, in certain moments of history, gone astray, because I think that the initial notion that there are these two kingdoms was largely designed to prevent the state from controlling religious affairs, and I think to prevent the church from becoming intertwined in the mechanics of government, which can be dangerous and has led to many problems in the past. But I actually believe that there are many issues that are outside of the simple area of, you could say, internal church governance that our faith has to affect, or it doesn't mean anything. And I don't know that Luther would have disagreed with that, but if he did, then I would disagree with him. And I think that you see issues like issues of life, that are, those are not sectarian issues, right? That's a question of fundamental faith, and I would say of natural law. And in those cases, the church can't be silent. So I think there are areas that overlap, right? I mean, I don't think it's possible to draw a completely pristine line between the two. And I think this is where, during the Third Reich, you had some Lutheran ministers who understood that, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, and Niemöller. There were some, but too many fell back on the two kingdoms doctrine to kind of step back, and they allowed the forces of totalitarianism to silence them by being too committed to an attempt to create that kind of pristine dividing line.
The second article of the Barmen Declaration, which of course was primarily drafted by the Reformed theologian Karl Barth, but was certainly shared by some of those leading Lutherans to which you were alluding, and ultimately signed by all of by people from both sides of that divide, makes very clear that the gospel liberates human beings for grateful service to the neighbor as well as to the Lord, and that no party, certainly not the state, that is incapable of redeeming and rescuing the whole human person can possibly claim an absolute authority over the human person. It is God and God alone who gives life and who also restores life. And therefore, it's God and God alone who can claim full authority over the human being. And the gospel liberates people to live in that grateful freedom. And so these people said no to the Nazi government and no to even their brethren in the churches. And by the way, this argument was going on also on the Catholic side, with a similar kind of result, that basically about a third of the Catholics and about a third of the Protestants held to the basics of the gospel and said no to the state, whereas the majority on both sides more or less went along. That's, again, what I mean about this situation being revealing. It's revealing not only about attitudes that the state is taking and that big business is taking, and that corporations and universities, I'm sorry to say, are taking, but it's revealing also about the mushiness of the church, in which many people are so absorbed in the priorities of the society around them and have their anthropology upside down, have their understanding of the God-soul-body relationship inverted, as to prioritize fear of a of a molecule over fear of God.
I also think that, this is not so much about avoiding suffering, because plenty of suffering is being imposed to avoid the disease. And everybody acknowledges that sacrifices of some kind are being made, even if they don't acknowledge the full extent of those sacrifices. I think it's more about control, and not just the state using this as a pretext to seize control, but people wanting to be in control of what happens to them. I think it has a lot more to do with that. Obviously, we're not crazy about suffering in our society either, but I think we're willing to do all sorts of crazy things and actually suffer a fair bit rather than admit that we're not in control.
Yes, no, I think that's quite right. And it has resulted in the irony that we have actually ceded control to people to whom it does not belong on all sorts of levels. Control of institutions, educational institutions, control of economies, control of drugs, control of everything, our movements. So in order to feel secure, we've ceded this control. It's almost like Dostoevsky and the and the Grand Inquisitor. It's not that bad, but it reveals how in fact people are thinking like this. They will exchange genuine freedoms for false securities, because in their freedom they are so insecure, because their freedom is not something they're receiving gratefully from God, but something they are desperately trying to achieve for themselves.
Well, if I could just add something briefly on that, I think that the other component that's at play is a rising level of utopianism among people. Or you could say, I guess, in the negative, as our society has drifted away from its Christian roots, it's drifted away from an understanding of original sin and the fact that we live in a world that is not perfect and is not going to be perfect. And there's a sense somehow that if only we manipulate power in just the right way, we can eliminate all of the inconveniences and problems of life, including an extremely a virus that passes along very quickly, right? An extremely contagious virus. Now, how we can combat that and produce this sort of perfect outcome for ourselves and others by handing over a sufficient amount of power to those who desire it.
We're going to return to the topic of civil disobedience later, but I'd like to talk about it specifically with regard to religious institutions. We touched on the situation in California. That's been one of the places where the double standards have been most egregious. There have been double standards in a lot of places with regards to, say, abortion clinics or whatever. But in terms of, certain forms of recreation and entertainment being allowed more than religious worship, that's something that's been seen in California. And the bishops and other religious groups are starting to sort of push back on that. The strongest stance that I know of was basically a joint effort. I don't know if they coordinated it or just did it at the same time, but by Catholics and Lutherans in Minnesota, I think that was back in May, just completely defying the lockdown. They probably had some social distancing and things like that going on in their services, but they refused to suspend public worship. So I guess we're all in agreement that, the churches should defy the state to some extent, going forward in these matters. But what's it looking like anyway? I mean, is the end already in sight for these restrictions on worship such that it's a moot point to talk about civil disobedience going forward? I mean, or are there places where it can conceivably be for another year that this is going on? Or is it more that we should be concerned about what's the next thing?
I don't think we know the duration of the present regime. We do know that there will be a next thing, and we can be reasonably certain that among next things, some will be far more serious than COVID has proven to be thus far. So those revelations that we are receiving from the current circumstances about attitudes in the state, attitudes in society, attitudes in the church, we need to take those seriously and think hard so that we're not caught napping, whether we're caught a few months from now in a second wave of a possibly mutated and more serious virus, or whether it's only the next time this happens, or whether it's the next time a really serious virus happens. We need to be prepared for all those different scenarios. And I think we need to get prepared quite quickly because, frankly, there's been as much confusion in the church as there has been in local and national and international governance.
Yeah. Or it could be something coming up with a completely different pretext for all we know, but just with this as the precedent for it. What do you think, Andrew? What are the prospects going forward for religious groups to respond to this and to try to at least do damage control? I mean, a bad precedent has already been set. There's no doubt about that. But to what extent can that be pushed back and reversed? And what would be some ways that could be done?
Well, one thing that could be done, which should be done, is that different religious groups, different churches, denominations, need to have a conversation among themselves, like the Lutherans and Catholics in Minnesota, and be prepared to present a more common front the next time that this happens. That's not going to be easy for a whole range of reasons, but I think it's really important. I think, if the Christian churches in California, for example, had basically 2/3 of them had said, we're opening, we're going to follow, different guidelines or whatever. We're going to be cautious, we're going to take precautions, but we're opening. Try to stop us. It would have been very hard for the state of California to deal with that. But the problem is it's been one here and one there. And it's like trying to launch D-Day by sending one landing craft at a time across the English Channel. It doesn't work. And so that conversation has to take place, I think, and the sooner the better. The other thing that could, waylay some of this is these guys are politicians, right? I mean, if they start to feel an electoral backlash, then that could have some effect. But that's, it's not clear that will happen in any of the places where it has to happen most. I mean, there's a reason that folks like this are in power, right? The voters have at least tolerated their views on these sorts of things, although there hasn't been an election to, since this erupted, to actually test public reaction to these particular steps. But, that is conceivably something that politicians listen to, right? If they start to see some of their colleagues lose because they've gone too far, then perhaps, but I guess I don't hold out a huge amount of hope in that respect.
There's kind of a thing people say, well, it's all going to go away in November. And I would certainly like to think so. But, look at what's happening in Victoria and so many other places in the world. Look at what's happening in Victoria, Australia in particular. I mean, the news coming out of there is just horrific. I saw a story about a pregnant woman getting arrested for posting on Facebook about an anti-lockdown protest. I found, they have high-powered drones flying around to find people who aren't wearing masks. And then several weeks ago they were locking people into their apartment complexes without warning. I mean, literally, the first time that people found out they couldn't go outside was when they tried to leave and they couldn't, and there were police outside. So this is not just about the election. It's hard to imagine that everything that's going on, all the crazy stuff that's happening this year, isn't to do with the election to some extent, but it can't be reduced to that. I don't think there's one thing that I'm sure of. There's no mechanistic solution to the problems that we have in our culture. It's going to require initiative and action. There's no waiting it out. People just have to take things into their own hands at a certain point. and stand up for their beliefs. Let's move on to your article, Andrew, The Limits of Expertise at the American Mind. A while back, I read a book by Yves Simon that really helped me, called The General Theory of Authority. One of the discussions in the book is on this kind of modern Enlightenment idea of a perfectly scientific administration that would almost do away with the need for authority. Authority in its proper function is replaced with expertise. But one of the points in your article, of course, and which we'll get to, is that there's no getting rid of authority. There's only masking it. There's masking it, and maybe there's replacing it with the sheer exercise of power, but it can't be replaced with expertise. Before we get to the more philosophical parts of your article, though, I wonder if we could get a brief overview of your case for why the experts haven't had the best track record in guiding us through this situation. Just briefly, because I don't want to spend too much time on the details of that.
So I guess there would be two aspects to that argument that I made. The first one is just that experts, no matter how much they know, don't know everything, right? They're not omniscient, and they're not clairvoyant, and they know a lot, and I don't want to denigrate the importance of people who know a lot, the formation of policy, but they disagree among themselves, right? I mean, they're not all knowing. And so in this crisis, you see that frequently. You saw the World Health Organization say at one point, early on, this is not a world health crisis. And then it was. And the Surgeon General of the United States said in early March, don't wear masks. And then it became wear masks if you want. And then it became you have to wear masks, right? I mean, there's actually if it wasn't real, it would be completely hilarious. But even in the seriousness of our times, it was rather funny. A video that you can see on YouTube of a purported scientific expert giving a press conference in which she's making a statement. Perhaps you've seen this. And it was actually produced long ago. I mean, after maybe a month or 6 weeks of the lockdowns, where she, is giving all of the both sides of all of the contradictory scientific advice that's been given by experts on this. So that's the first point. There is no such thing on difficult issues as the expert opinion. The second point is that experts generally, even though they might know a lot about their area, don't necessarily know a whole lot about any other area. And when you go to them to deal with something like a coronavirus, let's say, perhaps you go to public health experts and put them in charge of things, or say that you're putting them in charge of things. This isn't just a public health crisis, right? It's also an economic crisis. It's also a mental health crisis. It's also a family crisis. It's a crisis.
And it's a theological crisis. So
it's a theological crisis, right? And so I said in my piece, trying to deal with this problem by leaning almost entirely on public health experts is like trying to build an airplane by consulting only people who know how to build wings, right? I mean, you needed a bunch of people who were familiar with lots of areas, and then what you needed were statesmen or generalists who could kind of make sense of it and put the experts in their place and make the kind of prudential judgments and trade-offs that needed to be made. So that was my argument in those respects.
When you referred to scientists or public health authorities changing their minds on things, shouldn't that just give us all the more confidence in science, because it adjusts its dictums according to the increasing amounts of data that it gets? Or is that just how science works, or are we seeing a failure of some kind here?
That is how science works. But so the failure isn't by the scientists. The failure is by the policymakers who take a snapshot of what the scientists are saying at any one moment and decide that that's the fundamental truth by which everything should be oriented, or around which everything should be oriented. And so, I don't blame the scientists. I mean, they're doing science. They're learning more. They're getting more information. They're adjusting their views. That's what they should be doing. But what the policymakers should not be doing is saying, all we need to do to solve this crisis is to listen to the science and obey the science, because I guarantee you the science 3 months from now is going to be different than the science is right now. And, even back when they were making these initial decisions, the scientists were not fixed. It wasn't that they were wrong. It wasn't that they were all wrong in the same way. I mean, there were actually differences of opinion among scientific experts about whether, for example, a lockdown made sense. So, even back then, to say, well, we need to do the lockdown because the scientists say so and we need to obey the science, was kind of nonsense.
Right. I mean, my question from the beginning, and this is one reason I liked your article so much, is that when people say, listen to the scientists, which scientists? First of all, as you say, they're not all saying the same thing. Secondly, which fields? Because if by scientists you're including not only, epidemiologists, but economists, and not only those, but, philosophers and theologians, and in the end, people who have to make value judgments, and not only value judgments, but prudential judgments. Yves Simon talks about this illusion of modernity that if we had complete information, we would be able to make the best possible decision in any situation. But he argues that even if we had complete information, there actually often is no one best decision, even if your values are right. So it even goes beyond making value judgments. Sometimes you just have to make a decision so that society can be coordinated in an effective way, and you just have to pick a direction. But, of course, we're not in a situation where we have all the information. Can you give a big picture of what the record of our policy has been? I mean, how have these lockdowns worked out? What do we know about how effective they are and whether that was the best way to go at this point? It seems like new information is coming out every day.
That's the question. New information is coming out every day. In fact, I was thumbing through my today's issue of the Wall Street Journal to find on page looks like A15 an article by Donald L. Luskin titled "The Failed Experiment of COVID Lockdowns." And just to read one sentence from that, there's no escaping the evidence that at minimum heavy lockdowns were no more effective than light ones, and that opening up a lot was no more harmful than opening up a little. This is, and this is true. You can see evidence of this. There are studies that show this, not just in states in the United States, but in different countries around the world. Different strategies just didn't seem to make a whole lot of difference in terms of the disease. And I think the moment when I was firmly convinced of that, I sort of suspected that for a while based on different evidence that's being compiled. But in May, late May, Governor Cuomo in New York announced that of the recent cases, I think 66% of them had been people who had been observing the stay-at-home order, and another 19% were people who had been in locked down care facilities. Now, the lockdown care facilities, of course, were that was a kind of somewhat separate issue because the governor himself did things that made that much worse than it might have been. But even if you leave that out of the equation, 2/3 of the cases were people who were observing the stay-at-home order. And so, I think the evidence, people will continue to collect evidence. They'll continue to analyze it. I don't know what the final result will be from all of that. But right now, I think the evidence is pretty strong that the lockdown was not really a successful policy. Even if you take away all of the massive negative consequences from it, even if you just look at the public health result.
One thing that we should also think about in this context is the impact of this on the law. I mentioned in the Health-First Heresy, the Calvary Chapel case and the dispute between the minority and majority of the court. And you just mentioned these draconian actions taken by states in the South Pacific. What is the fallout of this going to be when it is examined legally? This is an important question. Do these Western democracies who are taking these draconian actions, Are they acting constitutionally or unconstitutionally? There's going to be a lot of not just electoral fallout, but and financial fallout. But there are huge, huge issues at stake here legally, which I don't think we've seen enough discussion of. The medical questions, the economic questions, the political questions, the religious questions. But what about the legal questions?
Well, that's a good question, and I think I'm not prepared to make too much of a guess on that for the reason that usually when there's a dramatic expansion of state power in something deemed to be an emergency, one of two things happens, and they're actually sort of opposite things, right? Sometimes it just becomes part of the norm. It becomes accepted and sets new, farther boundaries on what the state can do. Sometimes it provokes a backlash, which creates a very short-term effect. So you can see, for example, some of the emergency measures taken during the Civil War in the United States, or some of the emergency measures taken by Woodrow Wilson in World War I. After those wars were over, there was a very quick snapback and a kind of reaction against that sort of power that lasted for quite some time. So, I would say that that's the pattern. It's one of those two things, and they're radically different results. And I'm not sure yet which it will be. It really depends on the judgment of, at least in the United States, it depends on the judgment of Americans. In Australia, New Zealand, it's going to depend on the judgment of the people who live there, whether this was a necessary and useful thing that should be kept in reserve for future incidents, or whether it was an abuse and a mistake which should be pushed back. And I don't know which of those it will be at this point. I mean, I know which one I think it is, but I don't know which one most people will think it is.
In answer to Andrew's question as to what the citizens of these various states will do, I don't know, of course, what they will do, but I do know this. If in dealing with a virus with a very, very modest kill rate, they are prepared to have drones and lockdowns that are not even publicly announced, and some of those other actions to which you were alluding, then when something more serious confronts that society, as inevitably will be the case, presumably they will accept almost any level of authoritarian state control. And that to me is an enormously bad sign.
We started out talking about flattening the curve, and now we, in many places, have gone to, we want there to be 0 cases. Biden said that if he were elected and scientists told him to, he would completely shut down the economy, shut down the country until we had control of the virus, which is obviously beyond all reason.
That's where they all need to go to the school of King Canute. This is absurd.
Right.
Well, this gets back to the utopianism that I was talking about.
Right. My thought on this, though, has been, even for a more serious virus than this one, just shutting down society for months on end, multiple times, or indefinitely is just not a tenable solution. I mean, this is just not how we can live. And it's not safety first. As a friend of mine, speaking in a very different context, speaking about when he was teaching acting classes and dealing with kind of theater conventions about safety, it's never safety first. It's the thing that you're trying to accomplish first. And then safety is maybe second or third, but safety is for the sake of being able to do the thing that you're supposed to be doing. So it's not, if we have to shut down human life basically for long periods of time, it's not worth it. Going back to the more philosophical aspects of your article, Andrew, what's going on? You said when a public official says, I have to do X because my public health chief said I must do that. You said there's a number of different things that could be going on there, all of which are dangerous. So can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I said there were basically two things that could be going on there. One of which is that the public official has, in fact, actually delegated a massive amount of power to an unelected and unaccountable expert. Right, that's one possibility. The other, which is extremely problematic from any sort of standard of consent of the governed or government accountability. Or the other possibility is that because there are experts that you can find to say pretty much anything, the public official has acquired the advice of an expert who says what he wants to do anyway, right? And simply hides behind the expert to accomplish what he had sort of planned to do all along, he or she. And that's dangerous as well in a different way. Also, an accountability problem, kind of hidden, government by misdirection in some ways. And so I have a real problem with that. I think and this is not new, right? I think our eyes perhaps have been opened more fully to how far this has gone now. But this is a problem that's been around for a while. But it just seems like we're in a situation where we're in danger of being a republic in name only if we delegate to experts or claim to delegate to experts the decisions over these things that affect the lives and livelihoods and well-being, both material and spiritual, of millions of people.
Yeah, you said it is no exaggeration to say that government wielded either directly by unchecked experts or by politicians using experts for cover is simply inconsistent with both consent of the governed and the protection of fundamental rights.
Yes. I mean, I don't know what to add to that. I think that's true. I think that it's not compatible with fundamental principles of our government.
I just remembered a quote relevant to Andrew's piece from Noam Chomsky, who I've never really read, but I came across this quote a while back and I really like it. It's from a book from 1969 called American Power and the New Mandarins. He says, quite generally, what grounds are there for supposing that those whose claim to power is based on knowledge and technique will be more benign in their exercise of power than those whose claim is based on wealth or aristocratic origin? On the contrary, one might expect the new Mandarin to be dangerously arrogant, aggressive, and incapable of adjusting to failure as compared with his predecessor, whose claim to power was not diminished by honesty as to the limitations of his knowledge, lack of work to do, or demonstrable mistakes.
Yeah, I don't often agree with him, but I will agree about that.
Yeah, I agree with Douglas. That's my reaction as well. That might be one of the few Noam Chomsky quotes that you could offer me that I would endorse, but I like that.
We've talked, obviously, we've just referred to some of the ulterior motives for government officials here, but they're playing a dangerous game too, because, you would think that even government officials hurt themselves by hurting the economy, at least in something that could have such long-term effects. But are there other motives, other than sort of kind of totalitarian ones that might be at play here for government officials? Besides public health, legitimate public health motives and kind of the more obvious power seizing that we've just discussed. What's the calculation that you think is being made here?
Well, I think there are at least a couple of other things at play. One of them is that the ideology of government by expert, or the elevation of expertise, has become a kind of religion for some people. And I think that they sincerely believe it. They sincerely believe that it is the advance guard of progress in society to insist on this kind of devotion to expertise. And so I think that they aren't just using it as cover. I think sometimes they really do believe, frequently they really do believe that they are obligated to follow expert opinion, though of course more obligated to follow expert opinion that strengthens their position politically than otherwise. The other thing that I think is clearly going on, and I wouldn't underestimate it, is the fear of being held responsible if they don't do enough and things go bad. It's important to remember when this thing first started, there were wild estimates of how many people could die. In the United States, 2 or 3 million deaths were forecast by some modelers, another set of experts, right, who came to the politicians and said that 3 million people could die. And at that point, I think at the very beginning of this, there were a non-trivial number of policymakers who were just simply afraid of being, both for humanitarian reasons and political reasons, afraid of being caught on the wrong side of that. And, the consequences of acting as they did were and continue to be enormous. But I think they were driven to some extent by the fear of what the consequences would be of not doing it.
So here's my position. I think that we can't wait for there to be a vaccine. I think that we have to start engaging in civil disobedience, and we have to do it now, because if this all just ends because of a vaccine, I mean, of course, there's some pretty serious moral and ethical issues involving the vaccine, which I'm not going to get into here. But if people want to look into that, actually, our occasional writer, former Virginia delegate Bob Marshall, has written a very detailed study of all of the issues, scientific and ethical, and political and legal issues, including legal precedent for fast tracking and forcing a vaccine at catholicculture.org, which I guess I'll link to in the show notes. But anyway, what I was getting at is, if this just ends with a vaccine in a few months or whenever, I feel like a very bad lesson is being learned, which is that when this happens, we do whatever the state says and we shut everything down until the virus is gone because of a vaccine, which everyone is expected to take. I think that's why it's important to try to roll back the precedent that's already been set, whatever degree we can. And that means, not acting like a bunch of idiots, but it does mean some carefully, but not too carefully calculated acts of civil disobedience. And to be most effective, those, of course, need to be coordinated. And we need to do this not just for the sake of calling the state's bluff, but also for the sake of normalizing non-compliance with this. Because, as much as people get mad at someone and I'm not really even taking a position on the mask thing here, but as much as people get mad at someone who's not wearing a mask, at a certain point, if people are doing it and it's not, causing huge problems, then people will get used to it, even if they find it annoying. So I think that even in small ways, we can try to kind of change the paradigm here just by our own behavior. And I hope we can get into maybe some specific manifestations of that. But what do you think? What do you guys think of that overall assessment of what we need to be doing?
Well, I agree that a successful vaccine, as the eventuality that sends us out of this particular crisis, would be very much a mixed blessing. Of course, we have had crises before caused by viruses, both more or less serious crises, which have been resolved with a vaccine or which have resolved themselves naturally without a vaccine. And there would be no doubt a lot of debate as to whether it was in fact the vaccine that resolved it. But if these revelations that we've been exposed to were simply to be shelved and not dealt with because, we were relaxed now, we had a vaccine that actually worked, and perhaps it didn't prove as contentious ethically or politically or legally as it might well do. So we all breathe a sigh of relief and just get on with things and don't deal with what we've discovered. This I agree would be very unfortunate and dangerous. So drawing lines, the church drawing lines for the state, not just the state for the church, drawing lines, citizens against an arguably unconstitutional and overweening authority of the state. Different, of course, in different states with different constitutions and different exercises of that authority. But we've seen enough examples of overweening and draconian actions drawing these lines, I think now is very, very crucial. And I think, as you do, that cooperative action in the near future, in the immediate future, and is these are actually very important.
Especially with regard to education and simply going to work. I mean, we can debate about, social, recreational activities or whatever. I don't think we should be overly cautious there either. But especially with regard to educating your children and things like that, I think it's very important. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I would start with church, and I would say, as you said, work next, right? I think, and I think actually, at least in California, there was a kind of sense that people were building toward that before the relaxation in the early summer, and then there was the relaxation in the early summer, which convinced people that things were on the right track and things were, concerns were being listened to finally. And then, the lockdown was reestablished. It seemed like the steam kind of went out of the sentiment to really resist this or push back. But I think it's starting to build again, partly because of just the completely hypocritical way that our political overlords have dealt with this. Just, I don't know if you saw just yesterday or the day before, Nancy Pelosi found out to have gone to a hairstylist or something like this, when in fact the governor has banned them from operating. And
yeah, it was a shuttered hairstylist who wasn't even allowed otherwise to go to work.
Yes, exactly. And things like that, or you see, people, Dr. Fossey and others, caught in moments where they're not wearing their mask, as they badger everybody else to always wear their mask. I think that level of hypocrisy is really starting to grate on people. And I think that it is I think the sentiment for non-compliance is growing again.
But I think it does have to be coordinated to some extent with businesses and schools and stuff like that, because I do believe that, if we call the bluff, I don't think the consequences, maybe you have to be willing to be fined, or, to refuse to pay a fine and maybe you spend a weekend in jail or something. But I don't think the consequences will be that bad if enough people get involved.
Exactly.
I think ultimately the state will have to back down. And, we've already discussed so much of the cost of continuing to obey lockdowns socially and spiritually and politically. But you could also mention, just as an aside, the fact that we've had all this civil unrest and rioting, and that it's been as bad as it has been, I'm certain is due in large part to the lockdown. And of course, the fact that there's an election coming up. I don't think that it would have been so severe and ongoing and long lived as it has been. They say idle hands are the devil's playthings, or whatever variation of that expression you prefer. And this is a great example of that.
Yeah, I think it's contributed.
What about individuals? I mean, let's say you don't own a business. What are things that kind of isolated individuals can do in terms of civil disobedience, or kind of trying to shift the standard somewhat?
That's a difficult question. It's already difficult for businesses and schools and that sort of organization, because for them to act, they need a consensus at the board level and in the administration of the institution in question, which is extremely difficult to get. So I don't think we should put too much hope in a corporate level response in the business world and so forth. There's some hope there, but I think particularly when it comes to volunteer organizations and to private schools and so forth, many of the people who run these would be terribly afraid of putting themselves, that is their institution, and possibly themselves personally, in the way of legal action that's very, very expensive. There's no guarantee of success and so forth. So I think there's actually more hope in the common person saying enough is enough. I think many people recognize the hypocrisy in all of this, There are many things that we do that have higher health risks than being exposed to the coronavirus, and most of them are legal. I think people see the hypocrisy, but they don't really know what to do because if they can't say to their employer, well, look, I'm coming to work anyway. Some people can do that, but most people can't. They're breaking the law by taking a walk or whatever it is. Most of them say, well, I don't want to add to my troubles by going to jail or paying a fine. The sort of collective action that we could, I think, look for is probably going to come chiefly from the churches. The main line that will have to be contested, the religion, let's call it technocracy to use an old expression, and the control of the experts versus the religion of gratitude and of fearing God rather than man, fearing God rather than a virus. This is, I think, where the main contest is, and I don't see any reason why the churches shouldn't take a leading role in it.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, the only thing I can think of that I could do, living here in New York City, where I don't see much hope for, my favorite jazz club just deciding to reopen, on its own. I can see making a point of not being ridiculously, overcautious when it comes to wearing a mask or things like that. Obviously, we do still have a virus. Whether it's still a pandemic is debatable, but we do still have this virus, and we should be protecting the people who are especially vulnerable. For both of you, how do we sort of calculate what are still appropriate precautions to take versus what are appropriate measures of civil disobedience in terms of like taking into account that this thing still exists?
That's a good question. I guess for me, I don't like the masks, but I'm willing to go along with that because I think the cost is quite low. The intrusiveness of it is quite low relative to some other things. And if there's a possibility that it's a benefit in slowing the spread of this, I'm not going to complain about them publicly, right? I might complain to my wife because I really don't like those things very much. I don't know anybody who does, but that's something that I can see being a legitimate, precaution that should be adhered to, especially since many people, rightly or wrongly, really feel, quite endangered if you have if you see them in a line without it. The other thing is, I think the distancing rules of when you're at the store, staying 6 feet back from the next person in line, those sorts of things. It's hard to say how much good they do. They probably do some good. They don't really do any harm that I can calculate. They don't impinge on conscience in any way. They don't impinge on anyone's livelihood, really. So those sorts of measures, I think, are reasonable precautions. And I think it makes sense given the demographic of who is really at the most serious risk from this to have, much stricter rules around nursing homes and assisted living facilities and so on. Though I will say, I think that when people are gravely ill, for the hospital not to allow their family to come visit them is horrendous. And that needs to stop. That should have never been the case. But, I think to have a kind of more general lockdown of those sorts of facilities, perhaps not to the extreme that it's been done, but at least, substantially makes sense because those folks are the ones who are, most likely to die from this. But those would be some that I would identify as, in my view, things that, precautions that are reasonably sensible or at least relatively free of harm. In some cases might do good.
Any thoughts on that, Douglas?
Well, I've never been against reasonable precautions. I am not at all confident in what the authorities have been saying is reasonable. And as many people have pointed out, it's difficult to have confidence in them, not only when, as results come out, we realize that they've exaggerated the problem, that the proposed solutions as Andrew was saying earlier, do not seem in fact to have made much difference when applied. And as everyone has noticed, the precautions are only applied very selectively, so that it's fine to take part in a BLM protest, but not fine to go and honor your creator. So it's difficult to leave it simply to the prudential judgment of individuals, because your actions do have consequences for other people. We don't allow people to, to use the streets with their vehicles in any way they think all right. We do have laws, and they are applied and enforced to some extent. And you need public health regulations that are applied and enforced to some extent. But when those regulations are permitted to interfere with the most essential things of human life, if we were to say, well, look, this percentage of people get seriously ill and this percentage of people die because of certain sexual activities, so we will ban all sexual activities. Who would put up with that? This kind of inconsistency puts the lie to what has been done. And I think that we shouldn't be just focused on what's the best prudential judgment for dealing that we can make in dealing with this particular threat. We should be more focused. We should attend to that, but we should be more focused on the big issues and what is happening to our sense of freedom as we live instead in fear. So to me right now, it is more important to resist the regime of fear than it would that we had done that from the outset. But more important, even more important now, to resist the regime of fear than to make the best possible prudential judgment as to what will minimize the effects of the virus. Back in '69, when we had a major virus, the Hong Kong flu, we didn't do anything. And that probably wasn't the right answer, but it was a hell of a lot better than living in fear.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Douglas, for being so generous with your time, even more time than I indicated we would take. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope this does some people some good. I know, we didn't get that specific about what people should be doing in response, but I hope it encourages people to be creative and to talk to members of their community and start getting serious about pushing back on this, because it's just not going to be something that is resolved as a matter of course.
The churches gave a great deal of leadership in the civil rights movement, and they need to give that kind of leadership again. It needs to cross boundaries. It needs to be organized. You were saying some of this earlier. I agree with you. It is incumbent upon the leadership of the religious communities to show leadership and to allow their communities to show leadership in society at large in confronting what I think are very, very serious revelations about the dysfunctionality of our governments and at the same time their arrogance in trying to dominate our lives and dominating our lives as they have been.
Yeah, amen to that.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure.